Remove that fake metal before you go through security, the TSA supervisor barked at the 72-year-old man. The elderly veteran looked down at his Purple Heart, the medal he'd earned after taking shrapnel in Vietnam, and slowly began to unpin it. But what the supervisor didn't know was that another TSA agent was watching from across the terminal, and this agent recognized something that would change everything. It was 6:30 a.m. at Denver International Airport, and Frank Patterson was doing what he'd done dozens of times before, catching an early flight to visit his daughter in Phoenix. At 72, Frank moved slower than he used to, his left leg still stiff from the shrapnel that had torn through it in the jungles of Vietnam in 1968. But he moved with purpose, the same quiet determination that had carried him through 2 tours of duty and 50 years of civilian life. On his chest, pinned to his navy blue cardigan with the same precision he'd once used to clean his rifle, was his Purple Heart. Frank had earned it the hard way, bleeding into the mud of a firebase outside Da Nang while dragging 2 wounded soldiers to safety. He didn't wear it for attention or sympathy. He wore it because his late wife Margaret had insisted he should be proud of his service, and because it honored the men who hadn't made it home. Frank approached the security checkpoint with his boarding pass and ID ready, just like always. He'd been through this routine so many times he could do it in his sleep. Remove his shoes, place his carry-on in the bin, walk through the metal detector, collect his belongings. Simple, routine, respectful. But today was different. Today, TSA Supervisor David Jenkins was working the morning shift. Jenkins was 45 years old, had never served in the military, and had built his entire identity around the small amount of authority his position provided. He was the kind of man who enjoyed making people wait, who found satisfaction in forcing others to follow his rules, his way. He noticed the old man with the medal before, and it bothered him. It bothered him that someone would wear what looked like military decoration through his checkpoint, as if they were somehow special, somehow above the rules that applied to everyone else. As Frank approached the checkpoint, Jenkins stepped forward, his voice loud enough for other passengers to hear. "Sir, you need to remove that fake medal before proceeding through security." Frank stopped walking. The words hit him like a physical blow, not because they were loud, but because of what they implied. In 54 years of wearing that Purple Heart, no one had ever questioned its authenticity. No one had ever suggested he hadn't earned it with his blood. "I'm sorry," Frank said quietly, his voice carrying the slight rasp that came from decades of smoking cigarettes he'd quit 20 years too late. "That medal," Jenkins said, pointing directly at Frank's chest. "Remove it. Real Purple Hearts don't look like that, and I won't have people trying to get special treatment by wearing fake military decorations." The checkpoint area fell silent. Other passengers stopped moving, stopped talking, stopped pretending they weren't listening. A young mother pulled her children closer. A businessman looked up from his phone. Everyone was watching now, waiting to see what the old man would do. Frank didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand to speak to a manager or threaten to call the news. He simply looked down at the Purple Heart, the medal that represented the worst and best day of his life, and began to unpin it with trembling fingers. As he worked to remove the medal, Frank's mind drifted back to that day in Vietnam. The mortar round that had landed 10 feet from his position. The shrapnel that had torn through his leg and embedded itself in his hip. The 2 younger soldiers, barely 19 years old, screaming for help in the mud. The decision he made to crawl toward them instead of seeking cover, dragging them both to safety while his own blood mixed with the monsoon rain. The medal came free, and Frank placed it carefully in the gray plastic bin, right next to his wallet and his reading glasses. It looked smaller there, somehow diminished, just a piece of metal and ribbon sitting among the ordinary belongings of an ordinary traveler. "Thank you for your cooperation," Jenkins said with satisfaction, as if he'd just solved a major security threat. But 50 feet away, at checkpoint number 3, TSA Agent Carlos Martinez was staring in complete disbelief. Martinez was 28 years old, a second-generation Mexican-American whose father had served 2 tours in Vietnam with the 1st Cavalry Division. Carlos had grown up hearing stories about the war, about the men who had served, about the bonds forged in combat that lasted a lifetime. His father, Sergeant Roberto Martinez, had been wounded in action in 1968 and had spent months in military hospitals recovering from his injuries. And during those long nights in the hospital, Roberto had told his son, Carlos's father had talked about one man above all others. A soldier who had saved his life and the life of another wounded man during a mortar attack outside Hanoi. A man who had crawled through enemy fire with his own leg torn open, dragging two soldiers to safety before passing out from blood loss. Carlos had heard that story 100 times. He knew every detail: the date, the location, the weather, the sound the mortars made when they hit. And he knew the name of the man who had saved his father's life: Sergeant Frank Patterson, 1st Infantry Division. Roberto Martinez had died 5 years ago, but not before making his son promise to honor the memory of the men who had served. Not before showing him the faded photograph he'd kept in his wallet for 50 years, a picture of his hospital roommate, the man who had saved his life, the man he called his brother until the day he died. Carlos was looking at that man right now. The same weathered face, aged by decades but unmistakable. The same quiet dignity, the same way of standing even when the world was trying to break him down. And most importantly, the same Purple Heart that Roberto Martinez had described in perfect detail, down to the small dent in the ribbon clasp that had been caused by shrapnel. Carlos's hands began to shake. His father had spent 50 years wondering what had happened to Frank Patterson, the man who had saved his life. He'd tried to find him through veterans organizations, through military records, through letters to the Veterans Administration. But the trail had always gone cold, and Roberto had died never knowing if his savior was still alive. And now, Carlos was watching that same man be humiliated by his supervisor, forced to remove the medal he'd earned by bleeding for strangers in a jungle on the other side of the world. Carlos looked around the checkpoint. Other agents were busy with their own passengers, going through the motions of their morning routine. No one else had noticed what was happening at Checkpoint 1. No one else understood the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Frank had passed through the metal detector now and was collecting his belongings from a bin. He picked up his Purple Heart last, holding it for a moment as if weighing whether to put it back on. In the end, he slipped it into his pocket and began walking toward his gate, his shoulders slightly more stooped than they had been when he'd arrived. That's when Carlos made a decision that would change everything. He stepped away from his station, ignoring the confused looks of passengers in his line, and began walking quickly toward Checkpoint 1. His heart was pounding, his palms were sweating, but he knew exactly what he had to do. "Supervisor Jenkins," Carlos called out as he approached. Jenkins turned, clearly annoyed at being interrupted. "Agent Martinez, you should be at your station." "What is it?" Carlos looked past Jenkins to where Frank was walking slowly toward the departure gates, then back to his supervisor. "Sir, that man you just processed. The one with the Purple Heart. Can I ask why you made him remove his medal?" Jenkins shrugged. "Standard procedure. Fake military decorations are a security concern. People try to use them to get special treatment, jump lines, avoid searches. I've seen it 100 times. But sir," Carlos said, his voice growing stronger, "how do you know it was fake?" "Look, Martinez," Jenkins said with the tone of a man explaining something to a child. "I've been doing this job for 12 years. I know what real medals look like, and that wasn't one of them. Real Purple Hearts are issued with specific documentation, specific serial numbers. They don't just pin them on old cardigans and walk through airports." Carlos felt his anger building, but he kept his voice steady. "Sir, with respect, that man is Sergeant Frank Patterson, 1st Infantry Division, Vietnam War. He was awarded the Purple Heart in 1968 after being wounded while saving the lives of 2 fellow soldiers during a mortar attack outside Da Nang." Jenkins stared at him. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because one of those soldiers was my father." The words hung in the air like smoke. Jenkins opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. Around them, the normal sounds of the airport continued: announcements over the intercom, the rumble of luggage wheels, the chatter of travelers. But in their small corner of the security checkpoint, everything had gone silent. "Your father," Jenkins said finally. "Sergeant Roberto Martinez, 1st Cavalry Division. He spent his entire life trying to find the man who saved him in Vietnam. He described that Purple Heart to me 1,000 times, every detail, including the small dent in the ribbon clasp that was caused by the same shrapnel that wounded Sergeant Patterson. Carlos pulled out his phone and scrolled through his photos until he found what he was looking for, a picture of his father in his old Army uniform, standing next to a folded flag and a collection of medals, including his own Purple Heart. "This is my father," Carlos said, showing Jenkins the photo. "He died 5 years ago, but not before making me promise to honor the memory of the men who served with him, especially the man who saved his life." Jenkins stared at the photo, then looked in the direction Frank had gone. For the first time since Carlos had known him, his supervisor looked uncertain. I didn't know," Jenkins said quietly. "No," Carlos replied. "You didn't, but you made an assumption. You assumed that a 72-year-old man wearing a Purple Heart was somehow trying to deceive you, trying to get something he didn't deserve. You humiliated a war hero in front of dozens of people because you couldn't imagine that someone might have actually earned the right to wear that medal." Carlos could see other TSA agents starting to take notice of their conversation. A small crowd of passengers had gathered as well, close enough to hear, but trying to look like they weren't listening. "Agent Martinez," Jenkins said, his voice taking on a warning tone. "You need to return to your station." "In a minute," Carlos said. "First, I need to do something my father would have wanted me to do." Without waiting for permission, Carlos left the checkpoint area and began walking quickly toward the departure gates. He could hear Jenkins calling after him, but he didn't stop. He had to find Frank Patterson. After 50 years, the son of Roberto Martinez was finally going to meet the man who had saved his father's life. Carlos found Frank sitting alone at gate A23, staring out the window at the planes on the tarmac. The Purple Heart was still in his pocket, invisible now, as if it had never existed. "Excuse me," Carlos said, approaching carefully. "Are you Sergeant Frank Patterson?" Frank looked up, surprised. "Ah, yes. Well, I was. Long time ago." Carlos felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Sir, my name is Carlos Martinez. TSA Agent Carlos Martinez. My father was Sergeant Roberto Martinez, 1st Cavalry Division, Vietnam." Frank's expression changed immediately. The weariness left his eyes, replaced by something that looked like recognition, like hope. "Roberto," Frank said quietly. "Roberto Martinez? Small guy from Texas? Always talking about his wife Maria and his baby boy." "Yes, sir," Carlos said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That was my father." Frank stood up slowly, his left leg still stiff, his eyes never leaving Carlos's face. "Al, how is he? Is Roberto?" "He passed away 5 years ago, sir. Cancer." Frank's shoulders sagged. "I'm sorry. I tried to find him after the war, you know. Try to find all of them. But he tried to find you too," Carlos said. "He never stopped looking. He never stopped talking about what you did for him. He called you his guardian angel." The two men stood facing each other in the middle of the busy gate area, surrounded by travelers who had no idea they were witnessing a moment 50 years in the making. "He told me about the mortar attack," Carlos continued. "October 15th, 1968. Firebase Charlie. He said you crawled through enemy fire with your leg torn open to drag him and another soldier to safety. He said you saved his life and that he never got the chance to thank you properly." Frank wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I just did what anyone would have done." "No, sir," Carlos said firmly. "You did what a hero does. And my father spent the rest of his life trying to live up to the example you set that day." Frank reached into his pocket and pulled out the Purple Heart, holding it in his palm. The metal caught the fluorescent light of the terminal, and Carlos could see the small dent in the ribbon clasp that his father had described so many times. "Your supervisor back there," Frank said quietly. He said this was fake. Carlos felt his anger returning, but he kept his voice steady. "My supervisor is wrong, sir. And he's about to learn just how wrong he is." Carlos pulled out his phone and began recording a video. "Sir, would you mind if I recorded something? I think the world needs to hear this story." Frank looked uncertain. "I don't know. I'm not much for publicity." "It's not about publicity," Carlos said. "It's about honor. It's about making sure people understand what this medal represents. And it's about giving my father the closure he never got." Frank nodded slowly. For Roberto. For Roberto. Carlos held up his phone and began recording. My name is Carlos Martinez, and I'm a TSA agent at Denver International Airport. 30 minutes ago, my supervisor forced this man to remove his Purple Heart, claiming it was fake. What my supervisor didn't know is that this is Sergeant Frank Patterson, Vietnam War veteran, and the man who saved my father's life 50 years ago. Frank looked directly into the camera, his voice steady and clear. This Purple Heart was awarded to me in 1968 after I was wounded in action while helping evacuate casualties from Firebase Charlie. I earned it with my blood, and I've worn it with pride for 54 years. Not for myself, but for the men who didn't make it home. Carlos continued recording as Frank told the story of that day in Vietnam, the story Carlos's father had told him so many times. Words that Roberto had asked Carlos to deliver if he ever found the man who had saved his life. To my guardian angel, the letter began. I have thought about you every day for 50 years. I have wondered if you made it home safely, if you had a family, if you knew how much your sacrifice meant to all of us. I never got the chance to thank you properly, but I want you to know that everything good in my life, my wife, my children, my grandchildren, exists because of what you did that day in Vietnam. You didn't just save my life. You saved all the lives that came after. Thank you, my brother. Until we meet again, Roberto Martinez. Frank read the letter 3 times, then placed it carefully in a frame next to the photograph of his late wife, Margaret. That night, for the first time in years, he slept peacefully, knowing that his service had mattered, that the sacrifices had been worth it, that the bonds forged in combat truly did last a lifetime. As for Supervisor David Jenkins, he submitted his resignation the following week. In his letter to airport management, he wrote, I have learned that authority without wisdom is dangerous, and that assuming the worst about people says more about me than it does about them. I'm not fit to serve in a position where I interact with heroes, and I never was. The TSA issued new guidelines requiring additional training for all security personnel on recognizing and respecting legitimate military decorations. Carlos Martinez was promoted to shift supervisor and began leading those training sessions, always starting with the same story. The story of how his father's guardian angel walked through security one morning wearing his Purple Heart, and how that encounter changed everything. Frank Patterson continued to fly to Phoenix to visit his daughter, and he continued to wear his Purple Heart. But now, when he walked through security, TSA agents would nod respectfully, some even thanking him for his service. The medal that had once been questioned was now recognized for what it had always been, a symbol of sacrifice, courage, and the unbreakable bond between those who serve. And in his wallet, Frank now carried a new photograph, a picture of himself with Carlos Martinez, taken the day they met at the airport. On the back, in Carlos's handwriting, were the words his father had waited 50 years to say. Thank you for saving my father's life. Thank you for making my family possible. Thank you for being a hero when heroes were needed most. Sometimes justice comes through courts and judges and formal proceedings. Sometimes it comes through viral videos and public outcry and corporate policy changes. But sometimes justice comes through the simple recognition that heroes walk among us every day, wearing their service quietly, asking for nothing more than the respect they've earned through sacrifice. Frank Patterson earned that respect in the mud of Vietnam 50 years ago. It just took a TSA agent named Carlos Martinez to make sure the world remembered what real honor looks like.